Could immigration take the UK population to 70 million? Can we afford tax cuts? And Prime Minister's questions. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, broadcaster and statistician Timandra Harkness, and the editor of City AM, Andy Sylvester. On today's programme.
We've got a clear plan. It's working. Taxes will be coming down for people.
But not everyone likes that tax-cutting plan.
We would advise against further discretionary tax cuts as envisioned.
A projected surge in the UK population to 70 million, fuelled by immigration. But who shouldn't be allowed in? We hear from a Brit who can't return to the UK with her husband under the new rules.
Of all the things that he could save from the wreckage of the kamikaze budget that he chooses to press ahead with is their plan to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. Yeah.
But now Labour say they won't reimpose the bankers' bonus cap.
We will not have got every decision right, and we will have made misjudgments, and there will be undoubtedly instances put to me today where, on reflection, I will think that we could have been more transparent than we were.
Expletive-ridden messages, deleted WhatsApps. Nicola Sturgeon is giving evidence to the COVID inquiry.
Finally, people will be able to see the extent of what has been achieved by the DUP in delivering that change for Northern Ireland.
After the agreement to restore power sharing, Northern Ireland awaits the detail. We're expecting that whilst we're on air. All that and Rishi Sunak faces Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions at noon. We'll bring you that live. Well, let's start with the story you heard in the headlines about the UK's population growing faster than previously expected, and it's down to migration. That's according to new figures from the Office for National Statistics. Let's take a look at how the papers are covering that story. We'll start with the Financial Times. Population will surge to 70 million by 2026 on higher net migration, the ONS predicts. We can take a look at how The Sun is covering it. Migrant shock. What mandate do politicians think they have to let our population soar to the staggering totals now projected? And this is how The Mirror is looking at it. Greater Britain, behind the headline figure of the UK's population, reaching nearly 74 million by 2036, is a huge increase in elderly people. My opening question, starting with you, Barry, is it a good or a bad thing? Surging population fuelled mainly by migration, according to the ONS.
Yeah. Look, what we are seeing is, as the Mirror said, a growth in the elderly population. So people are living longer and fewer people are being born. And that accounts for 500,000 of the projected increase. But I think what you've got to look at is the increase in migration into this country for work is 65% increase. But the increase for work in terms of social and health care, looking after our elderly population, is 165%. So what we're seeing is people are coming into this country to work because we need it. Why? Because the government has not put in place the skills programme and paid people enough to get them into those care jobs, to get them into the nursing jobs that we need. So we're importing our workforce. That is bad for the UK, and it's bad for our younger people who need those skills, who need those training, who should be trained on into those jobs and encouraged.
Catherine.
So just on that, that's why we've put the long-term workforce plan in place. And I think since 2010, there's something like 39,000 more doctors and 55,000 more nurses. So
yeah, but you did cut a lot of those.
That's an investment. No, the health spending's been ring-fenced. I think so. Immigration more broadly,
is it a good or a bad thing?
Well, so these are ONS figures. It's important to remember that they're projections. So what they've done is they've taken what's happened in the past and they're projecting them out in the future, and it's too high. That figure is too high, and we've been saying that since before Christmas. We announced a load of measures in December to start to make sure that if people are coming, they're not abusing the hospitality that we've got. And that's before you even get to the illegal migration, which is, another important thing to control. So, I can list out what we're doing, but
we'll come on to that as a basis that might, to some extent, mitigate some of the increase. But at the moment, it's too high in your mind.
I think so.
Is it too high?
I'll answer your first question. With an asterisk, I think it's a good thing. When you look at the demographics, as Barry alluded to, unless we've got a raft of youngsters, 20, 30-somethings coming into the country and working, contributing to the public finances, but also the economy, we ain't going to grow. We can't pay for public services as our population ages. So if you take that as the baseline, that more people need to be in work of a certain age, we either need to start on a very different kind of skills programme across the country with 16-year-olds and start having them getting out like rabbits, or we go and find people from overseas and invite them in to contribute to the United Kingdom.
Well, it's an option, I suppose, yes.
You build houses, you invest in the public services where there are high levels of immigration, because immigration is a benefit to the UK economy that has localised negative impacts. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of a government of either red or blue to be able to manage that for the long-term future. And it is tiresome, if I'm honest, to hear Westminster constantly following public opinion on this rather than attempting to lead.
Can I come back? Because I don't think necessarily saying all immigration is bad and those figures are too high is mutually. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. There are some people that have been coming and have been taking advantage of the system, and it's important to close that down, because then you open out the conversation to get public support for the skilled workers that we need.
But Catherine, the focus that this government has had, always talking about immigration in terms of illegal immigration, in terms of the boat people, right? You're spending £400 million on this Rwanda scheme, which nobody believes either is working or should
go on the Rwanda scheme. Let's focus on
But that £400 million could have been spent on apprenticeships, on making sure that actually the skills training was being given to our young people to get them into those jobs that we're importing people to do
for poor people that are being sold a pup and are by gangsters and are dying in the Channel.
Right.
It's not acceptable.
As I say, we're going to park Rwanda because we talk about it an awful lot, and let's talk about whether it's a good or a bad thing to have high levels of immigration. You're a statistician. What's going on here?
Barely a statistician, but well, yes. I mean,
you're the closest.
I think actually, I think kind of Barry spelled it rather well. That what we have is there's going to be about 500,000 extra people aside from immigration, because we are living longer and we're not having many babies. I never expected to hear a call for more teenage pregnancies on this programme, but, I guess we should consider all policies. So that is part of it, and that does mean that the kind of the age profile of the people in this country is going higher. So we have fewer working age people, we will have more people needing care. So then we do need somebody to do that work and looking after the people, but also do the productive work that's going to pay the taxes, blah, blah, blah. But the question for me is, but how does that work? Because you can have immigration where you say, we would like people to come from other countries and settle here and make their homes here and become part of our communities and society and contribute and long-term raise their children here,
and what about the
become
services
part of the population, but we need services and infrastructure. But what we're getting at the moment is not. We're getting immigration where people come, they either come as low-paid workers rather than paying people properly here, or we get students coming here and putting money into the economy, which is fine. I mean, it's it's great to have an international student
community. But we're not encouraging them long term because we're telling them they can't bring their families.
Exactly.
We're saying you can't bring your family. You can only bring your spouse here if you're going to be earning over £37,000
exactly. So we're
a year.
Embedding this model of bringing people either to hand over lots of.
But hang on, just to go back to Andy's point,
to work for low wages and not integrate and not settle. And that has a very corrosive effect on local communities.
Yeah, well, and we'll come on to some of the specifics, but broadly, as Andy said, you're fed up with Westminster because Labour politicians have also said that immigration, broadly speaking, is too high. They don't want to put a figure on it, but they do say that levels of net migration are too high. So who should come here?
Look, I agree with you, but I agree with you because we should be developing our own skills and our own talents, and we haven't been.
Right.
And that is the failure of the past 14 years. But to now say, when you're bringing people in, you're not going to allow them to bring their families. Well, what does that do for a local community? It means predominantly you've got a load of working age men who don't have their families here, who are sending repatriation money back to their home countries and who feel no stake in this society and who are really isolated. It's really correct.
Well, let Catherine respond and I'll go through some of the measures.
That they can be a contributor to society as opposed to a beneficiary.
And they are.
So I would agree, but there are some financial thresholds which I think we're going to get to where you are finding a balance. And there is a truth, which is that some people, especially using the care visa systems, there have been abuses within that system. You know, one of the reforms that we've announced is, you know, people who are sponsoring visas need to be registered with the CQC.
Can I interject then just to give you a summary and our viewers a summary of what the Home Office is planning to do to cut migration? We can show you the tweet here. Banned overseas students from bringing their families to the UK unless they're on postgraduate research degrees, raising the minimum income requirement for family visas that's been mentioned, stopping immigration undercutting British workers by raising the minimum income threshold for skilled workers to £38,700 a year and scrapping the 20% going rate salary discounts offered for shortage occupations. Is that going to be enough to bring down migration to the sort of level you want to see?
Well, I mean, I'd be interested to see the date on that tweet because it's a plan. It's people being aware of the fact that we've got figures that are too high and that we're doing something about it. Will it be definitive? I don't know. But what we can't have is the projections that the ONS are coming out with no action. But here's the point.
Why can't we? Why can't we sustain that population?
Because of all the reasons and messages that are over there. But what would Labour do? Where is Labour's plan?
Well, hang on.
There's lots of kind of you're being mean to these people, you're being mean to these people, and you can't say because ultimately, you know, there's Keir Starmer especially. He's doing a bit of sniping from the sidelines, but he's not coming forward with what he'd do because you know how much it would divide the Labour
Catherine,
Party.
You've had 14 years to do it,
and this plan came out. This plan came out yesterday, by the way.
And actually,
right. So but the measures were announced in December.
They were, but the tweet came out yesterday.
In the 13 years that you've so far been in government, okay, migration has gone up by 6 million, even though every single Prime Minister you've had has said they're going to bring it down. During the period that Labour was in office, it went up by 4 million in the 13 years. So you've actually done 50% more migration into this country than we did.
But that's including the EU period, which is what the referendum vote
beneficial to the economy or not?
Exactly. Well,
and sometimes it will be depending on your demography. But at the moment, we're going to need those people to keep the economic
So you do
engine.
broadly agree that the higher levels, because we need them, are acceptable and sustainable?
Unless you train your own people into those
What do you make
jobs?
of those that sort of 4-point plan or whatever it is?
It strikes me as being unlikely to make major changes because when you look at a global level, this is attempting to stop migration. We're in King Canute trying to hold back the tide territory, right? Global patterns dictate that more and more people will be coming from that part of the world to this part of the world. And while this country has had a problem with illegal immigration since Boudicca, we have to react to the world that we're living in rather than this sort of Betjeman nostalgia. And unless politicians grip that and they start planning, then what do you think our politics is going to become? It's going to become nastier, it's going to become more divisive, and it's going to not allow us to make the economic decisions for the country.
And countries compared to so proud of us. Well, you look across, look at the AFD, the National Rally, formerly Front National, some of the elections in Holland we've had recently. I'm very proud of this country and its ability to integrate people. That's not the same, and I think you're missing the other dynamic in these statistics, which is there is an assumption that the only way we can grow is by increasing our labour. What about the innovations of AI? You know, the Cabinet Office is already starting with that. We need to become more productive as well as make sure...
Well, as you know, Catherine, being more productive has been elusive, let's put it that way, for successive governments. Well, you say that there is a risk that the country could become more divisive and nastier. Let's talk to someone who's directly affected by one of the plans put forward by the Home Office, Sarah Douglas. She's a British citizen living in Italy and joins me now. Sarah, tell me about your situation.
Okay, hi. So first of all, I'd like to say that my situation is not unique. There are many who have similar stories to mine living both in the UK and around the globe. So I moved to Italy in 2007, initially for a year, but then met an Italian, ended up getting married, having our 3 children and making Italy our home. We'd always planned to return to the UK when our children reached school age to be closer to family, amongst other reasons. Then Brexit happened, put a spanner in the works, and I was faced with the prospect of having to separate my family to sponsor a spouse visa for my husband, either leaving my young children in Italy while I moved to the UK to work to meet the minimum income requirement, or leaving my husband and moving alone with my 3 children, separating them from their father and trying to work while essentially being a single mum. Unwilling to put my family through this hardship, we decided to use the savings route. Not easy in the current climate, but we were getting there and approaching the possibility of applying for the visa. And now the goalposts have changed yet again, with the minimum income requirement set to raise to £38,700. It becomes an impossibility for my family. The average wage in the Scottish borders, which is where I would move to, is around £32,000. How would I be able to meet that as a full-time mum and the primary caregiver of 3 young children?
All right, Sarah, let's get some... Well, I'm going to get some response to your situation. First of all, from you, Catherine, what would you say to Sarah? Because it's going to make her plan, her family's plan, impossible to come back and resettle in Scotland because of the minimum salary requirement.
Yeah, I feel very much for her personal circumstances, but it's the messages that we've got to deliver about making sure that people that come to this country are contributing and not withdrawing from the state and the systems, you know, with education, with healthcare. You know, there's the opportunity for you to retrain or get a different job, or for your husband to get a job that allows you to achieve the salary threshold.
My husband has a job and earns more than the minimum income requirement, but his salary is not taken into consideration. We own our own home outright. We're financially secure and stable. It counts for nothing. Now, statistics show that meeting the MIR is significantly more difficult for certain demographics than others. For example, 55% of working women would not be able to meet the current MIR of £18,600, compared with 27% of men. 41% of Scottish people would not be able to meet the requirement, compared with 27% of Londoners.
All right.
So why should only certain people or rich people have the right to fall in love with people from abroad?
Well, it's a good question.
British people would not be able to sponsor a spouse visa.
Let me put that to both our politicians, but first of all, again, Catherine, because Sarah has to be the sponsor, and so it's her salary that counts.
I feel very much for the individual circumstances, but we are we're talking about a much bigger picture here, which is making sure that our education system, our housing, our infrastructure, our healthcare is not put under unsustainable pressure by people that aren't contributing. And those rates are going up slowly. They're not. It's not a massive hike to give people time to.
Well, let me just get a reaction from Barry. Would Labour reduce that minimum income threshold?
Sarah, I think you've been a fantastic advocate for the position you've outlined, and I'm really sorry for your family. What you said about falling in love with somebody, both my children who are married have married people who are not British. And would Labour reduce that threshold? Look, Sarah was absolutely right. Her husband will be here contributing to the UK.
Yeah, but would you help her? I mean, if you win,
absolutely.
If Labour wins this year, you would have that threshold go back down to 18,000, whatever it is.
Because we're looking at a point. We're looking at a points-based system where her husband's potential will be taken into account. And I think it's absolutely wrong that we've got this divisive policy that is dividing families, forcing them to make completely unnatural decisions about where they want to be, who they want to be, and how they want to live together.
Well, let me get some reaction from Andy.
I see it every day in my constituency because being as diverse in Brent North, but people are in real pain and anger about this. And the idea that we're separating families, that we're separating loved ones, it's simply not good enough.
But what would you do with the overall figures? What alternative plan do you have to help make sure that we head into the 21st century on a sustainable footing?
I've already outlined that we would be training people.
Yeah, but that will take time, Barry. What would you do immediately?
The points-based system that Labour is going to introduce in order to make sure
to use our Brexit freedoms that allow us to control it much more. Because you were talking about immigration since 2010. You know, it's Labour that opened the door to immigration from the EU.
4 million under Labour, 6 million under the Conservatives.
But Catherine, net migration has soared under these last few Conservative governments. What do you make? Listening to Sarah, and she says she's not unique, her family situation isn't unique. What do you think the government should do? Any government?
We cannot have a rational discussion about immigration in this country until illegal immigration is sorted. On that, I will certainly agree, and it colours everything that we discuss. When you hear that, it is clearly, forget the personal side of things, it's clearly an economic no-brainer that we should be opening the doors. And until we can have that rational discussion, until we can enter the economics into this debate, until we can talk about cultural integration and being harder on those communities that have become separate from the rest of the UK, we're just aimlessly waffling, and Westminster is out-competing to sound nastier. Where's the people shouting about the immigrant entrepreneurs? Where's the people shouting about our great cities that are built on the backs of entrepreneurs?
That's not fair. Look at the Ukrainians that we've welcomed. Look at the Syrians that we've welcomed. This country, you can't go around South Ribble without seeing Ukrainian flags up. That's part of these figures.
I don't think this country is unfriendly. I think Westminster's rhetoric is unfriendly.
Tamandra, what do you make of this particular sort of plan to cut levels of net migration and Sarah's situation?
Well, I think, as I was saying before, we have to choose, like, do we want people to come here with the hope that they will settle and raise families and maybe change that demographic back a bit so that we're not 50% over 85. I know it's not that much, but an extra million over 85-year-olds by the end of these projections. If we actually want, without Andy's plan of raising teenage pregnancy again,
well, I think it was more about
if we want to have a population where we have a lot of young people and working age people, surely we want to encourage people to bring their families here. To me, when people struggle, they say, you know, I could move here and get a job, but I don't meet the threshold to support my family on the visa. What it says to me is we are not paying people enough. Jobs that should pay people enough to support their families are not paying people enough to support their families. And this is why we have the problem with trying to bring care workers in. Because we're trying to bring care workers in, but we're paying them less than people here will work to do care work for. The problem is that care work is undervalued and underpaid.
But there's another problem, which is actually there's not a brilliant understanding of how far up the salary threshold, how salary rates you have to go before you become a net contributor to the state rather than a net receiver of state support. And ultimately, we do have to make the numbers add up. We can't just continue to balloon down.
Let me just go back to Sarah finally, and for a final word. Sarah, where are you now? What's the sort of prognosis going forward for you and your family?
Well, it's unclear at the moment if the savings requirement will also be raised. If it does, then we're looking at, basically not being able to return to the UK. Or, well, I'm faced with the choice between family separation or enforced exile. That's our options.
Right. Well, that's pretty grim.
Point to make about being a burden on the UK taxpayer. Visa applicants have no recourse to public funds. They have to pay an NHS surcharge when they make the visa application, on top of any income tax and national insurance contributions. So they essentially pay twice into the public purse. Sarah, so that's not an issue.
All right, Sarah, I'm going to stop you, but thank you very much for telling us about your situation and, well, maybe come back and tell us if anything changes in the future. We're going to talk about tax cuts, or not, as the case may be. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times. Little room for big tax cuts. Hunt tells Tories the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, urges Chancellor to curb borrowing instead. Now, this refers to the Chancellor telling the Cabinet yesterday, apparently, that tax cuts in next month's budget, March the 6th, may be smaller than expected because major structural weaknesses in the economy. Now, it follows on from a warning by the IMF, you heard it in the headlines, to the government yesterday advising against further tax cuts. Now, that's a very different tone and sentiment from Jeremy Hunt when you look at this headline from The Telegraph 2 weeks ago. Hunt plots tax cuts as inflation crisis eases. Chancellor admits voters are very angry about high levies. And it goes on to say that he had signalled, the Chancellor, that he would deliver a tax-cutting budget. Catherine, which Jeremy Hunt do you prefer?
All of them.
Oh, you like them all?
But
do you like the big tax-cutting one from 2 weeks ago or the much smaller tax-cutting one from yesterday?
So this is a man with a plan. He's set out what he needs to do. So inflation crisis ease, that doesn't happen without, the IMF itself has said that we took decisive action to get inflation down. In doing that, what we're doing is trying to make sure that we've got debt falling, as one of the Prime Minister's 5 things, is halve inflation, which is important, and there's also to start making sure that we are
governments do like to take credit, don't they, for falling inflation? Not so much when it goes back up again.
It's the IMF. It's not. The IMF. It was decisive action.
But do you like the little tax cuts or the bigger tax cuts?
I like a plan that's deliverable. So we've done loads of hard work to get to the point where we've already delivered tax cuts for like 27 million people. It's 2% off national insurance is important. If you're on 35,000, which is the average wage, we've just been talking about immigration, that's £450 a month.
It is, but the overall tax burden, as you know, of course, eats that up.
We helped in tough times. We've spent over 500 billion between COVID and supporting, the fuel costs. Thanks, Vladimir. It's true. And so we've got to be responsible with the public finances and make sure we get debt falling. But within whatever wiggle room he's got, I'm a Conservative and I believe people are better able to spend their own money than the state is. So I'd like
Catherine wants to see tax cuts. It's whether they will now be very, very small or perhaps disappear altogether, or they're going to be much bigger, as Jeremy Hunt had indicated.
Well, I mean, we are expecting a budget which is, for all intents and purposes, the last roll of the dice, the Conservative Party ahead of the election. The easiest way to do your expectation management and get it in the papers is to tell the Cabinet, right? Because
they'll leak it everywhere.
Yeah, you might think that I couldn't possibly comment.
There's clearly a political strategy here. I suppose more broadly around tax cuts, spending, etc., the IMF, the frustration there is that it's as if all of these large multinational economic bodies have forgotten why tax and spend exists, which is to pay for public services, but otherwise to allow economic growth to pay for the rest of it, right? And we know two things to be true in the United Kingdom, at least. Higher taxes beyond a certain point restrict growth. And we know that we need growth, which we currently don't have, to pay for the public services that are at the heart of our conversation around immigration, for instance.
It's a conundrum.
So when we have a high tax burden, which is at its highest, and the IMF is saying you can't cut taxes, do the IMF just want us to ratchet up forever? Does Westminster want us to ratchet up forever? At what point do we say, hang on, maybe the state's a bit in the way here, maybe the state's doing too much? And I think, unless we have a wider discussion, the idea of tax cuts when they have to be quote unquote paid for, it creates a completely false debate.
Right. I mean, but just on that, there may be a strategy that says that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt were sort of laying the ground to see what the reaction might be. Because look what happened when Liz Truss and, as Labour called it, her kamikaze budget went forth. The markets reacted very dramatically. Do you think there is something behind that here? Jeremy Hunt talking about it, now retrenching after the IMF gives its verdict.
Yeah, I mean, well, a little around bond yields. They're in, frankly, all of the sturmaging around the Truss quartering budget. They've sort of shot up to back where they were post Bank of England issue. So there are issues around the UK's sustainable public finances, no doubt. This may be running it up the flagpole. I think that
it's just for our viewers, bond yields being borrowing costs.
Effectively, the cost of borrowing. Yeah. And we do an awful lot of that at the moment. there needs to be a sustainable public finances discussion. Just saying, oh, the fiscal rules let us do this and the fiscal rules do us like that is, frankly, saying, oh, well, I can't fix the rules when you set your rules yourself. So,
I completely agree, and that's why, you know, it's that we give an 11 billion tax cut to business, which is dragging in, you know, the full expensing is enormous. You know, being able to invest in your business. We've got increasing rates of foreign direct investment, increasing rates of exports. You know, we're doing the stuff that drives the growth and getting pelters for perhaps not doing as much as we'd like to on personal taxation.
But corporation tax has gone up up under Boris, which is a fairly significant.
But the full expensing is
one.
huge.
And as you know, the national insurance cuts came after fiscal drag, which means that we're all paying higher taxes anyway. So I don't think it's fair for the Conservative. Is a great place to do it. I don't think it's fair for the Conservative Party to ask for, look what we did in September, October, November last year, and forget what we did beforehand. You can't do that.
What we were supporting
and Labour, by the way, are just as bad. They're not telling us what they're going to do.
Labour just haven't got a plan.
Well, hang on. Well, let's come to Labour.
We had to support people through COVID and the cost of living, you know, and Putin's fuel crisis. But we've done it responsibly. We've now got to get back on track.
Right. Well, let's get it. Well, hang on. First of all, the first question is, if there are tax cuts, will you back them?
Let me say why the IMF have said that we haven't got room for further tax cuts. They've said that because they've just downgraded the UK's growth projection for next year from 2% to 1.6%.
Well, that's not good if Labour wins the next election.
But they upgraded it 2% a while ago, to be fair.
Jo, you're absolutely right. If we win this election, we'll be inheriting an economy in a dreadful state after 14 years of this Conservative government.
So can we or can we not afford tax cuts in this budget?
There are cuts that I would certainly like to see. Right, tax cuts. I would certainly like to see. Yeah, absolutely.
Which ones?
I'd like to see tax cuts on VAT for insulating your home, for example, because what that would do is it would address fuel poverty and it would also reduce our carbon emissions. I think there. No, but there are lots of. We always seem to talk about tax cuts as if the only thing we can talk about is income tax. It's not.
Well, it is what Labour support said it too, because the overall tax burden is too high.
You're about to start taxing private school fees. The Labour Party talking about tax cuts when it's just tax rises in the plan. If you're either going to borrow, whatever you come out with, you've either got to borrow or you've got to raise taxes. And if you say you're out not borrowing, then you've got to raise taxes.
We will. I'm sure Rachel will set out our plans in due course. But the point is this, right? We are now with a record level of peacetime debt in this country, and we're at a record level of taxation in this country. Now,
Would you have not helped
Hang on,
Catherine.
Catherine, I still haven't heard what Barry would like to see happen. Maybe this will help. This is a piece in your paper, City AM. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, and Sadiq Khan, Labour's Mayor of London, tells City AM readers, when you succeed, we all succeed. What do they mean?
They mean when financial services does well, it creates growth and it's good for the country. It pays the bills. And what an extraordinary thing to hear from the Labour Party 5 years after Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. I think the reason they've done that, by the way, is that there's still some convincing to do amongst the business community of the Labour Party. There's been a huge amount of engagement over the past 4 years, and certainly everybody's on the same page about partnership, etc. But we are now at the point, as has been alluded to, where the rubber's going to have to hit the road. There was some stuff in the plan that released this morning around financial services, but that manifesto is going to have to be quite detailed, I think, to truly win business over.
Well, and this is one of the bits you heard in the headlines. BBC News bankers' bonuses, no cap under Labour, says Reeves, and that's despite saying of all the things that Jeremy Hunt could save from the wreckage of the kamikaze budget that he chooses to press ahead with is their plan to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. Well, no more. Do you approve?
No, I don't. No, I don't approve of that. I disagree with the leadership on that. I think actually one of the things that we do see in this society is the gap between the very richest and the very poorest is growing day by day, and people are fed up with it.
So you'd like to see a wealth tax on the...
No, look, I want to see a society that comes together, that doesn't have people who are struggling to keep the light on in their own home when, you know, people down the road are getting...
You can't criticise us for debt when we help people with energy bills and then come out with that. You just did the...
So I didn't...
You're talking about us having to borrow to support people to heat their homes
No,
during the cost of living.
Don't put words in my mouth, Catherine.
Catherine, let him say, because actually I just have to warn you, you're going to be leaving in a moment or so, because you've got to get into the chamber. But that's all right, finish your thought.
Yeah. No, I want to see a society in which people are not, on the one hand, almost destitute, and on the other hand, seeing people who are being given twice as much as their basic income. I believe that people should be paid a decent wage, and the bonus they get should be not double what their basic wage is.
So you disagree. So you disagree. Just to be clear, you disagree with Rachel Reeves. Yes, you would like to see Labour reimpose that cap.
I'd like to see that there. Yeah, it's still there. It was introduced by a Conservative government, so I don't see that Catherine can argue against it. It was only Liz Truss that tried to get rid of it. It is actually divisive in our society to have people who are able to see that sort of wealth in your face when you are struggling to put food on the table.
Chancellor thinks.
What do you make, first of all, of the IMF's warning about we can't afford the tax cuts, which is where we started, and getting to a stage where Labour is now saying we're going to look to the city as the key driver for economic growth and increased tax revenues?
OK, well, I'd like to take it in reverse order. I won't duck them. But I actually think that it's completely performative to impose a cap on bankers' bonuses and then to discuss whether to take it away. You're saying, oh, we're going to arbitrarily limit what the very well-paid people can get as a bonus. Well, that's not how you affect how low-paid people get paid. I mean, if anything, they're going to pay tax on it, aren't they? If anything, you're going to get more tax from it. Great. I think it's absolutely bizarre that people are so hung up on it. I can see the sentiment underneath it, and I agree that there are huge disparities and they're growing between people's wealth. But I think capping bankers' bonuses is like, well, so you're going to stop some of the very richest people getting very large bonuses and their salaries will go up. But I think it does reflect the fact that apologies to your readers, but there's so much of the British economy rests on financial services. How did we come to this, where in many cases moving around semi-fictitious financial instruments is the source of so much of Western economies, not just Britain, but Western economies. It's the weakness of the productive economy that underlines the lack of growth. And this is why the whole tax thing is a problem, because you are right that it's economic growth that funds taxes, which enables us to provide services. But if we reach the point where, as a country, we cannot run the basic fundamentals of a functioning country, like transport and a postal system, then how on earth can you run a proper business here? Energy costs. Energy costs. It's like, let's blame Putin for energy costs. Energy prices were going up before Putin.
Well, and on that,
and we're already struggling to afford it. And this is why we don't have a steel industry. This is why we need why we don't have a steel industry in this country is because energy in this country costs so much more than the rest of Europe.
Well, and on that, before Barry goes then, how do you feel about the Green Prosperity Plan, the £28 billion being invested in green policies, looking very shaky, maybe even being dropped by the end of this week, beginning of next, perhaps? But Labour not wanting to reimpose that bankers' cap. Is it the wrong approach?
Look, I think if you believe that having what was a Green Prosperity Plan is the only way to sustainably grow the economy, then it can make no sense to say that we won't begin the Green Prosperity Plan until we've sustainably grown the economy. I'm afraid I was a philosopher. I did logic. But you have to. This is the way we grow the economy. It is the new technologies. It's
£28 billion.
Well, I'm going to let Catherine
respond. You're either going to have to borrow, or you're going to have to put up taxes, or you're going to break the fiscal rules.
And the difference between you and me, Catherine, over the past 14 years and the past 28 years is this. We borrowed to invest, you borrowed to consume.
Well, you might not borrow to invest, of course, as it turns out. I'm going to say goodbye.
The scale of the screeching U-turn.
Very briefly, because we're going to move on to the COVID inquiry in Scotland, but we'll say goodbye to that.
This is a screech. Just last quarter, there was still going on about this.
I think we've done that, Catherine. It is a screeching U-turn.
It's like an Acme thing, where they've kind of gone off the cliff and the dust is rising, they will say anything they think will matter to get into power, and they haven't.
Who'd have thought it? A politician saying anything that they might to get into power. Yes, and he said,
billion.
And the Labour Party
on
is
that,
not united
let's move
on
to the
this.
COVID inquiry, because Scotland's former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is giving evidence, has been giving evidence to the inquiry all morning. She, of course, led the Scottish response to the coronavirus outbreak. She's facing questions about her leadership during that time, and particularly around disappearing WhatsApp messages afterwards. Let's have a listen.
One of the reasons why I don't believe that WhatsApp, for example, should be used for government communication and decision making is that, you know, when I make a public statement, or when I made public statements as First Minister in this context, I would think very, very carefully about the words I use to try to minimise as far as is ever possible the scope for what I was saying to be misinterpreted. When people send messages on WhatsApp, they don't think, including me, you don't think that deeply about how you're phrasing things, and therefore messages, when they are looked back at later on, can be open to different interpretations because people haven't really thought about the words they're using or the phraseology that they're using. And I think that certainly would be true of some of the exchanges that the inquiry has been looking at.
Scotland correspondent David Wallace-Lockhart is outside the inquiry. How embarrassing is all of this for Nicola Sturgeon? Because, of course, it was revealed they were rather sweary, some of those WhatsApp messages, and then that quite a lot of them had been deleted.
Yeah, you'll remember we did get some of Nicola Sturgeon's WhatsApps last week that had been saved by her chief advisor, where she was, to put it lightly, perhaps slightly disobliging about Boris Johnson, and perhaps those are the kind of messages she's talking about there, where she talked about people not expressing themselves as they would in more formal settings. But you're right to point out, Jo, the bigger question so far this morning for Nicola Sturgeon when it comes to WhatsApps has been around her deleting hers from the time of the pandemic. That's despite her assuring back a couple of years ago that any inquiry would have access to anything it needed, including her WhatsApp. She's spent some of this morning trying to explain how she still feels she's provided the inquiry with that, pointing to Scottish Government guidance that did tell ministers and officials that once they had gone through their WhatsApps, taken out what was significant, important, decision-making, relevant information, saving that centrally on the Scottish Government records, they were then encouraged to delete the messages. So Nicola Sturgeon's argument is essentially that, one, she wasn't using WhatsApp for decision-making really, and secondly, that anything important did get taken out of her messages and saved centrally. That's not good enough for representatives here of COVID-bereaved families who have accused her, in their words, of industrial deletion of messages and feel that she's not been open and transparent enough. We have seen some of our WhatsApps that have been saved by the other side of the conversation. They did show discussions about restrictions that hospitality should be facing at certain times, seeming to weigh up the pros and cons of certain measures. It was put to Nicola Sturgeon that this looks a lot like decision-making happening on WhatsApp, on an informal platform. Her argument is that these same discussions have been had in Cabinet, in government minutes, in more formal forums. Therefore, it's a duplication, and that record of those decisions, those discussions, still does exist centrally. I think the inquiry has somewhat gone round in circles on the WhatsApp issue, and those who feel that Nicola Sturgeon hasn't been open enough are simply going to never feel that that's not the case. But Nicola Sturgeon really pointed to that government guidance that did say you could delete messages.
All right, David Wallace-Lockhart there outside the inquiry. Thank you very much. Apologies for some of the, I think it was wind interference there, but we could hear pretty well everything you said. We've got Prime Minister's questions coming up in a few moments' time. We can have a look inside the chamber as it's filling up. They're waiting for the Prime Minister to respond to questions from the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. And it's a big moment. I mean, it has been from yesterday, and it will continue to be so in politics as Northern Ireland is on the cusp of power sharing being restored at Stormont after a 2-year stalemate. For the first time, probably by Saturday, the First Minister at Stormont will be from Sinn Féin. Michelle O'Neill will be sworn in as early as this weekend. Now, today, we are expecting, after Prime Minister's questions, that the government is going to publish the deal deal that they said had been agreed with changes to trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that provided reassurances for the Democratic Unionist Party to return to work at Stormont. We're also expecting a statement along those lines from the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris. Catherine, broadly, your response to what will be a historic moment, power sharing being restored and Michelle O'Neill as Sinn Féin's First Minister?
So I think it's about making sure that we're delivering for the people of Northern Ireland. You know, it's been a long time now where they haven't had that kind of representative government. So, you know, I haven't seen the details.
No.
I don't want to talk to them. I think it's important not to speculate in this area, but it's the people of Northern Ireland that benefit if a deal can be done, and I think that's the important thing to remember.
Right. I mean, when it comes to trade, the issue was around the DUP being very unhappy about what they saw as further separation from GB, from Great Britain, because of checks on goods down the Irish Sea. It's true, we don't know the detail as yet, but in order for the DUP to come back into power sharing, it would have to be pretty strong in terms of no checks or very, very few.
I mean, without guessing, yeah, you would assume so. So with guessing, yes, you would assume so. And I suppose, I hope, perhaps vainly, that certain elements of all political parties in the UK, particularly, you know, the right, harder Brexiteer wing of the Conservative Party, accept the fact that this is something that's been approved by the people of Northern Ireland, the political parties of Northern Ireland, and perhaps cannot have a blazing row over the detail and the Star Chamber stuff and just accept that the DUP, Sinn Féin, the people of Northern Ireland are happy and leave well alone.
Well, I mean, Tamandra, that is still the question. We don't have the detail, and so there possibly won't be questions necessarily from Brexiteer Tory MPs today. But do you have any fears about the sort of limits to any further divergence from the EU as a result of what's probably been agreed? We may have to go, and I may interrupt you, but go for it.
Well, I mean, it's inevitably going to be a fudge, isn't it? Because our membership, when we were members of the EU, that kind of papered over the fact that Northern Ireland had this slightly ambiguous existence. They were part of the island of Ireland. Some people there wanted to be part of the Irish state. They're also part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And when we were all part of the EU and there were no borders, that was fine. It kind of that all worked, this slightly ambiguous status, and then with Brexit it didn't work. And I have to say that people on all sides have rather thrown Northern Ireland under the bus. The EU has made no concessions for them. The state of Ireland really hasn't made very many concessions that I can see to help them manage this. And the British government neither.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday I met the families of Grace O'Malley Kumar, Barnaby Webber and Ian Coates, who were killed in Nottingham. I assured them that we would do whatever it takes to get the answers that they want. And Mr. Speaker, following constructive dialogue over past months, I welcome the significant steps the DUP have taken to make restoration of the executive possible. I also thank the other political parties in Northern Ireland for the patience that they have shown. After 2 years without an executive, there is now the prospect of power sharing back up and running, strengthening our union, giving people the local accountable government that they need, and offering a brighter future for Northern Ireland. My right honourable friend, the Northern Ireland Secretary, will be making a statement shortly. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joanna Choice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with a constituent who was employed not by the Post Office but by a supermarket who operated a franchise post office. She was wrongly accused of dishonesty as a result of the faulty Horizon system, and she was put through a disciplinary process by her employers, the supermarket. This has had a very profound impact on her life. She's not alone, there are others in her position, and yet there's no provision for compensating people who worked in franchise post offices like her. Will the Prime Minister give me a commitment to include these victims in the Horizon scandal compensation scheme?
Minister.
Well, first of all, can I say I'm very sorry to hear about the Honourable Lady's constituent's case. As I've said, this was an awful miscarriage of justice, and everyone affected deserved not just justice but also compensation and answers. I'll make sure that we look into the precise details of her constituent's case, and surely there will be others like that, and make sure that the Minister gets back to her with all due haste.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sustainable aviation fuel plays a significant part in the sector's decarbonisation. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, commit to further policies for a SAF mandate to generate greater demand, for a revenue support mechanism such as other sectors, solar and wind power generation as well, and so that work starts by the end of next year on the 5 promised sustainable aviation plants here in the UK?
Prime Minister.
I can give my honourable friend the assurance that we are committed to ensuring the SAF mandate will be in place by 2025. And by mandating the use of sustainable aviation fuel, not only will we be able to deliver carbon savings, but also create a brand new UK market. And as one of the steps in introducing the revenue certainty mechanism that he talks about by 2026, DfT will be consulting in the spring this year on options for how that should work in practice.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in welcoming the DUP statement about the return of the Northern Ireland Executive? This is an important moment, and we now need all sides to work together to get Stormont back up and running for the people of Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, I too met the families of Grace, Barnaby and Ian on Monday, and it's impossible to express in words the horror that they've been through and continue to go through, and we must all redouble our efforts to do everything that we can to help them with their campaign. And of course, Mr. Speaker, this week 2 young lives, 16-year-old Max and 15-year-old Mason, were taken in Bristol, and I know the whole House will join me in sending condolences to their families and their friends. Mr. Speaker, one of the most difficult experiences for any member of this House is speaking to those at the sharp end of this government's cost of living crisis. So nobody could fail to be moved by the plight of the member for Mid Norfolk. His mortgage has gone up £1,200 a month. He's been forced to quit his dream job to pay for it. A Tory MP counting the cost of Tory chaos. After 14 years, have we finally discovered what they meant when they said, "We're all in this together"?
Well, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the mortgage charter that the Chancellor introduced last year, millions of mortgage holders across the country are benefiting from support with their mortgages, because it's important, rather than take the approach that the honourable gentleman just did, is actually focus on the practical support in place to help people who do need help. And someone on a typical mortgage is able to now save hundreds of pounds thanks to those reforms. And actually what we have recently seen is mortgage applications now at a multi-month high as a result of confidence returning. But if he really cared about helping people with the cost of living, Mr. Speaker, he would actually do more to celebrate and acknowledge the fact that thanks to our plan, millions of working people will now start to pay hundreds of pounds less in tax from this month's pay slips, Mr. Speaker. But we all know that's not a priority for him. He said he wanted to back people with the cost of living, but now he has described tax cuts, I read, as salting the earth. His shadow chancellor, it seems, is equally confused. In Davos, she said she did back tax cuts, but back here in Westminster, she called them a scorched earth policy. She obviously can't decide which Wikipedia page to copy this week.
Mr. Speaker, for every £2 he says he's giving people back, he's taking £10 out of their back pocket in higher tax, and he thinks they should be dancing in the street and thanking him. There are 200,000 people, Prime Minister, just like the member for Mid Norfolk, coming off fixed-rate mortgages and paying more each and every month because they crashed the economy. Does the Prime Minister actually know how much their monthly repayments are going up by?
Prime Minister. As I said, Mr. Speaker, someone on a typical mortgage of about £140,000 with 17 years left is currently paying around £800 as a result of the ability to extend their mortgage term or switch to a 6-month-only, interest-only mortgage. They will be able to save hundreds of pounds, and that is someone on the average mortgage, Mr. Speaker. But again, Mr. Speaker, he says he cares about the cost of living. The thing that would have the biggest impact on everyone's cost of living is the fact that his ideas to spend £28 billion, which we had just confirmed this morning by a shadow Treasury Minister, I heard, confirmed that they remain committed to them, but he has no plan to pay for this £28 billion, Mr. Speaker. No plan at all. And that's typical Labour economics, because they want to keep the spending but drop the payment plan. And I actually saw at the weekend their former leader, his mentor, was clear that they'll make their sums add up with tax rises on people's assets. Their homes, their pensions and their businesses. It's the same old Labour Party, Mr. Speaker. No plan and back to square one with higher taxes.
Mr. Speaker, they've crashed the economy, mortgages are through the roof, they've doubled the debt, and he thinks he can stand there and lecture other people about fiscal responsibility. But he didn't answer the question. Hundreds of thousands of people are coming off fixed-rate mortgages and facing huge mortgage increases. And the Prime Minister won't even do them the courtesy of answering the question. No, he didn't. So I'll ask him again.
I was very clear at the beginning, and I mean that my constituents to hear it. If yours don't, please leave. Keir Starmer.
Does the Prime Minister have any idea how much mortgages are going up by this month for those coming off fixed-rate mortgages?
Prime Minister. Well, again, I'll just point him back to my previous answer, Mr. Speaker. As I went him through, everyone's situation will be different. As someone on a typical mortgage of around £140,000, who's currently paying £800, will be able to keep their mortgage payment essentially the same by using the facilitations that the Chancellor has put in place. But again, that's what we've done to help people, Mr. Speaker. But again, it's incumbent on him to explain to the British public how his policy of decarbonising the grid by 2030 is going to be funded. He won't give the answers, but helpfully, the Shadow Energy Secretary popped up at the weekend in an interview in the Sunday Times. He said they don't need a plan to pay for it, Mr. Speaker, because in his words, it will produce real savings and it makes clear economic sense. Now, the Shadow Leader here doesn't want to talk about it at all, but let me tell him, I see all these years later, it's the same story. The Right Honourable Member for Doncaster North has carved a promise in stone, and everyone else just looks away in embarrassment.
Mr. Speaker, he just doesn't get it. They crashed the economy, mortgages skyrocketing, doubling the debt. They say they're going to max out the government's credit card at the next budget, and he won't.
Order. I think the Chief Whip's getting very carried away. He doesn't want to lead everybody for a cup of tea, does he? Come on.
They have forfeited the right to be lecturing others about the economy. Somebody coming off a fixed-rate mortgage is going to be paying an average of £240 more each and every month. A constant reminder that working people are paying the price for the damage that they've done to the economy. This week, I met one of the employees at Iceland in Warrington, Phil. I'm sure Phil would be...
Order. Mr Gibson. Sorry. Mr Starmer. Order. The same voice keeps appearing again. It won't appear anymore. So I'm just letting you know now. Keir Starmer.
Laughing at an employee at Iceland who's struggling with his mortgage. Shame. He told me that his mortgage is going up by a staggering £1,000 a month, Prime Minister. He doesn't want other averages, other people, other stories. That's what's happening to him. If the member for Mid-Norfolk on £120,000 can't afford this Tory government, how on earth can people like Phil?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the management of the economy, Phil and millions... Phil and millions of people like him are now ensuring that inflation is less than half of the rate that it was when we were talking a year ago, putting more money in their pocket. And thanks to this government, Phil and millions of other workers, not just at Iceland, but across the country, are benefiting this month in their pay packet for a tax cut worth hundreds of pounds for someone on an average salary. But I hope he explained to Phil the cost of his policies. Did he explain to Phil how Phil is going to have to pay for his £28 billion green spending spree, how it's going to cost Phil in higher taxes, more coming out of his pay packet, and did he explain to Phil that he'd be better off sticking with our plan rather than going back to square one with him?
I would invite the Prime Minister to get in touch with Phil and explain to him how paying £1,000 more on his mortgage is making him better off, because that's not how he feels. He's just so out of touch. It's unbelievable. Finding hundreds of pounds extra a month, that may not seem like a big deal to the Prime Minister. But let me tell him, most people don't have that sort of money knocking around. And if that wasn't bad enough, Mr. Speaker, this week he told every council in the country to put their council tax up by the maximum of 5%. That's 26 tax rises now, Prime Minister. And he says everything's fine, people are better off. But when people see their mortgages going up, their council tax going up, food prices still going up, who does he expect them to believe? His boasts or their bank account?
Minister! Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I was puzzled because, again, he resorts, as always, to the politics of envy here. But after recently and repeatedly attacking not just me but the government for lifting the bonus cap, I was genuinely surprised to see that the Shadow Chancellor just today has announced that she now supports the government's policy on the bankers' bonus cap. I don't know if he mentioned that to Phil when he was having a chat with him, but I'm sure he can fill us in. But I can tell him that trust and economic credibility come from sticking to a plan. But it's becoming clear you cannot trust a word that he says. And again, when the Shadow Chancellor says or claims that they won't borrow much, they won't raise Phil's taxes, we now know that those promises simply, again, they just aren't worth the Wikipedia page they were copied from.
Mr. Speaker, I actually didn't expect him to be laughing at Phil. I did not expect him to be laughing at Phil, not addressing.
Hold on. Look, I made this statement very clear. I don't. Prime Minister, it's very serious that we make sure that people hear, both you and the Leader of the Opposition. It matters to the people who watch the proceedings of this chamber, and it's not good in the behaviour that seems to be carried out. Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister just doesn't get how hard it is for millions of people across the country like Phil. That is the primary problem, struggling with their mortgages, their bills, the spiralling cost of living. And the Prime Minister's response is never to take responsibility, show contrition, or even any level of basic understanding. He's so detached, he thinks he can paint a world in which their problems simply don't exist. The problem is he can't even fool his own MPs, let alone anyone else. The member for Mid-Norfolk says he's exhausted. He's looking forward to new opportunities outside of Parliament. Why doesn't the Prime Minister do him a favour, call an election, so he and the whole country can move on?
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. But whether it's Phil, whether it's everyone else across the country, the plan that we're putting in place is working to help people, and we're making progress. Just this week, taking action to stop children from vaping. Just this week, ensuring that people can visit their pharmacies to get the healthcare they need, freeing up millions of GP appointments. And just this week, millions of working people starting to see hundreds of pounds of tax cuts delivered in their pay packet, Mr. Speaker. That is a plan that is working. All he's offering is £28 billion of tax rises. And that is the choice, Mr. Speaker. It's a brighter future with us, or back to square one with them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister likes to attend live sport, and so I wonder whether he would join me in welcoming the decision of the Planning Inspector in upholding Rugby Council's rejection of an application for development at Brandon Stadium in my constituency to keep the doors open for it to remain a sporting venue so that future generations will enjoy the thrills and spills of motorcycle speedway and stock cars.
Prime Minister. Well, I join my honourable friend in paying tribute and being proud of actually Britain's rich history in the automotive and motorsport sectors, and the stadium that he talks about is a historic motorsport venue, and whilst it's been a shame to see it fall into disrepair, I hope that the decision he refers to enables a possibility of both speedway and stock car racing to return, and I know that my honourable friend will rightly continue to champion this cause.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr Speaker, when the Tories scrapped the cap on bankers' bonuses in the autumn during a cost of living crisis, the Labour Party rightly opposed it. Yet here we are, just 3 months later, and the Labour Party support scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses. Shameful. But is the Prime Minister comforted by the fact that he's now no longer alone in this House on being completely out of touch with public opinion?
Well, Mr Speaker, as I said at the time, we supported the decision of the independent regulator because this was the right thing for financial stability. But that, Mr Speaker, is because on this side of the House, we have a set of convictions and we have a plan and we stick to it. But he's absolutely right to point out the flip-flopping and U-turning and no convictions of the party opposite.
Of course, Mr Speaker, scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses was only made possible due to Brexit. So what the Westminster parties are now telling the public is that it's OK for bankers to have unlimited Brexit bonuses, but for the public sitting at home, struggling to feed their families, they have to suck up and deal with the additional food price cost as a result of Brexit red tape. That is the cost and that is the reality of broken Brexit Britain. Isn't it the case that the great achievement of this Tory government is getting the Labour Party to agree to that bleak future?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we're actually delivering benefits for people across Scotland, not just least in new free trade deals that are opening up markets for Scottish exporters, free ports that are attracting jobs and investment, the Brexit pubs guarantee, cutting the cost of a pint in Scottish pubs. But when he talks about the cost of living, Mr Speaker, the thing that he could do most to help is make sure that Scotland isn't the highest tax part of the United Kingdom. And it's not just for high earners, Mr Speaker. Everybody earning £28,500 or more is paying more tax in Scotland than they would in England, thanks to the SNP.
Leila Davison.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One punch thrown, 2 days on life support, then 3 children left without a father. A 4-year sentence handed down, released after 2, but one grieving mother has to live a life sentence of agony. Sentencing for one-punch killers is not working in this country. Does the Prime Minister agree that now is the time to finally introduce a specific offence and a tougher minimum sentence for one-punch manslaughter?
Prime Minister.
I pay tribute to the work my honourable friend has done in bringing attention to so-called one-punch manslaughter and highlighting, as she knows well, the anguish those cases cause for the families of the victims. And I know the Ministry of Justice has looked very carefully at the amendment that my honourable friend has proposed, and I know that she'll be meeting the Minister for Safeguarding shortly to both discuss her specific amendment and how we might best address the wider issue.
Sir Ed Davey.
Speaker.
Order. Ed Davey.
My constituent Millie, a wheelchair user, had a serious accident at a sporting event. Millie was left waiting on the floor in pain for over 2 hours before an ambulance arrived. During her months in hospital since, she's been dropped badly multiple times, left stuck in her bed for days at length. She's even been told to soil herself when there's no one to take her to the toilet. Before all this, Millie was living independently and working, but the prospect of her returning to work is being destroyed by the crisis in the NHS and care system. I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree that no one should ever have to go through what Millie has, so will he look again at our proposals to make sure every patient gets the high-quality care they need?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about Millie's case, and if there are specific aspects of it that need to be examined, I'm sure the Health Secretary will follow up with the honourable gentleman. And more generally, we want to make sure everyone gets the care they deserve, which is why we're not just investing record sums in the NHS, but ensuring that there are record numbers of doctors, nurses, and new innovative forms of treatment like surgical hubs and virtual wards, all of which is showing that ambulance times that he mentioned are lower today than they were this time last year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The #1 reason for children's hospital admissions in North Devon is for dental treatment. We have no NHS capacity and no orthodontist in Barnstable. Our dentists cannot recruit, even with large golden hellos. The emergency dental plan does seem to have been stuck at the Treasury forever. My right honourable friend uses spare set of keys and pop round and rescue it for us, please. My constituents and I would be ever so grateful.
Prime Minister. My honourable friend has rightly championed the provision of dentistry in her local area. We're investing £3 billion a year, and the reformed contracts in dentistry from the NHS have improved access while ensuring fairer remuneration for dentists, and we're also providing more financial support for those who need it the most. So around half of the course of treatment last year were delivered to those who are non-paying, both adults and children. But yes, more needs to be done, and that's why our dentistry recovery plan will be published shortly.
Andrew Bridgen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 2 decades ago, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair misled this House by promoting and endorsing the Post Office Horizon IT system as perfect, protecting the large corporation that created it and causing untold harm and damage and misery to innocent people. Can the current Prime Minister think of anything he has promoted in partnership with huge businesses as safe and effective, which has ultimately harmed the British people? And will he use this opportunity to correct that safe and effective statement, or will he choose the same line as Tony Blair, sit back, do nothing, and let the misery just continue to pile up?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as we've been clear, the Horizon scandal is a terrible miscarriage of justice, and we're doing everything that we can to make it right. To what he was more broadly insinuating, let me be unequivocal from this dispatch box that COVID vaccines are safe, Mr. Speaker.
Jill Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The shocking revelations of the Horizon scandal highlighted the Post Office's financial incompetence, and my right honourable friend will know that the public's confidence in the institution is at an all-time low. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that, as high street banks are closing branches across the country, we should look to developing new community banking solutions rather than giving the Post Office sole responsibility for providing access to cash and other banking services in poorly served neighbourhoods?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for a question, but I also just say that we shouldn't mistake conflating this scandal with the actions of many hard-working local postmasters and sub-postmasters, because customers can access cash and banking services through a wide range of channels, including a contract with the Post Office counter service, which does provide a valuable channel. And that, I agree with her, though, the importance of access to cash, which is why the government has legislated to protect that as part of the recent Financial Services and Markets Act, and ensures that the vast majority of people should be no more than 3 miles away from such a cash point.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the Nolan principles, integrity, states that holders of public office should not act to gain material benefits for themselves, their family or their friends. Prime Minister, on the 6th of January, you tweeted a link to the Conservative Party website which seemed to scrape people's data and place unwanted cookies on their machines. The Good Law Project is now pursuing. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that no laws have been broken by his party?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, of course our party follows all laws.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a first responsibility for government is to fix the housing crisis that young people didn't cause. 3 years ago, we dragged house building in this country up to the highest level since 1987, after the last Labour government left it at its lowest level since the 1920s. But house building is weakening. We need to do more. Will my right honourable friend consider using the budget to do as he and I did together during the pandemic and cut stamp duty to boost housing starts, to reignite the economy and to support thousands of businesses across our country.
Prime Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend is right to point out that since 2010 we have delivered 2.5 million additional homes, on track to deliver 1 million just in this Parliament, and help over 850,000 families into home ownership through schemes such as Help to Buy and Right to Buy. Obviously, tax decisions are a matter for the Chancellor, but I would point out that our existing stamp duty relief for first-time buyers ensures the vast majority of first-time buyers in our country pay absolutely no stamp duty.
Marshal de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The APPG on eye health and visual impairment has today published polling that found that nearly half of employers exclude blind and partially sighted people from their workplaces, and 1 in 4 said that they would not be willing to make workplace adjustments. The disability employment gap remains stubbornly at 30%, and the pay gap means that blind and partially sighted people effectively work for free for 47 days of the year. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and sight loss organisations to discuss how we can create a more inclusive workforce?
Prime Minister.
Well, I share the honourable lady's ambition to have an inclusive workforce, and the record in supporting those with disabilities into work over the past several years has been incredibly strong. I know this is something that the Work and Pension Secretary is actively looking at and making sure that our accessibility plan is up to date and inclusive, and I'll ensure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Mr. Speaker, having visited recently, I know that Israel remains in shock following the rape, murder and butchery of Hamas. All of us want to see a peaceful and demilitarised Palestinian state. However, Hamas remain in control in large parts of Gaza. Their support is growing in the West Bank. Nearly 2/3 of Palestinians in polling reject coexistence with Israel, and the Palestinian Authority has continued to promote hatred of Jews. Does my right honourable friend agree that any recognition of a Palestinian state must address these issues and can only come about as part of a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Palestinians?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government's position is clear. My honourable friend is right that there are steps and conditions that need to be put in place on this journey. First and foremost, the removal of Hamas from Gaza, a Palestinian-led government in Gaza and the West Bank, a concrete plan to reform and support the Palestinian Authority, a reconstruction plan for Gaza, and a two-state solution, which we have long supported. So let me be clear. We stand with Israel, and the terrorist threat that they face must be limited, and Israel's lasting security must be guaranteed.
Mr. Speaker, on the 15th of November last year, I appealed to the Prime Minister to choose de-escalation and peace over violence, death and destruction. He called me naive. So far, over 26,000 souls have perished in Gaza. Shameful. In a powerful and moving open letter in Monday's New York Times, the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council cited Deuteronomy. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, accusing President Biden of choosing death. If the Prime Minister won't listen to me or the ICJ, will he listen to the Rabbinical Council, or will he call them naive too?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've been clear multiple times that we are concerned, deeply concerned, about the impact of the fighting in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives, and there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support in Gaza. I won't go over all the debates we've had about the conditions that are necessary for an immediate pause leading to a sustainable ceasefire, but I can assure the House that we are doing everything that we can to get more aid into the region as quickly as possible.
Kelly Tolhurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chatham Docks supports over 800 local high-value jobs which are at risk as the owners are continuing in their pursuit to displace successful businesses such as ArcelorMittal Kent Wire. The Labour Council are failing to honour the commitment they made before the local elections to protect the docks and the jobs. Even their leader, the Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras, said he was proudly backing Save Chatham Docks campaign. Will my Right Honourable friend meet with me to see how we can protect the docks and save those jobs for my constituents? And isn't this just another example of how Labour and their leaders change their position depending on which way the wind blows?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has been a constant champion of Chatham Docks, and I am disappointed to hear that the local Labour Council are failing to honour the commitments that they've made. But also, as she points out, I'm not surprised to see that the Leader of the Opposition has said one thing and then consequently done another. The docs support hundreds of jobs, and I join with her in calling on the Council to rethink their approach.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
And that brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions. Joining me for this half of the Politics Live programme, we have for the Government Nusrat Ghani, Industry Minister. For Labour, Wes Streeting, Shadow Health Secretary, and the BBC's political correspondent, Leila Nathoo. Welcome to all of you. Well, it was an interesting start to Prime Minister's Questions by Sir Keir Starmer, because he referred to, let's just show you this headline, George Freeman, a Conservative MP who has resigned his ministerial post in order to earn more money outside of Parliament because he's been stung by increased monthly mortgage payments coming off, presumably, his fixed-rate deal. Now, he was on a ministerial salary of £118,300, but you can see here voters criticise MP who couldn't afford mortgage. You can understand why, can't you, Leila?
Yeah, and you can understand why Keir Starmer chose to bring that up today, inviting people to get out their tiny violins for George Freeman, who couldn't afford his mortgage, gone up, he said, from £800 to £2,000 a month. Obviously, what Keir Starmer was trying to do there was draw attention to the fact that these mortgage rises have, in large part, been caused by economic policies, drawing attention back to the impact of Liz Truss's mini-budget. So talking about things like we're all in this together, even government ministers are finding themselves unable to afford their mortgages. This was the theme that Keir Starmer picked up on his exchanges, brought up Phil, somebody he'd talked to, who said that his monthly mortgage payment has gone up by £1,000. So really trying to bring back there to the government to say, look, this is your fault. Rishi Sunak trying to point to support packages that he said. You know, he said that people can now go on to interest only.
Although I think you have to be claiming benefits, certainly for one of them.
So exactly. So there are sort of measures that Jeremy Hunt has put in place, like going on to interest-only mortgage for 6 months, extending your term. But of course, you still have to pay back the money.
I mean, the truth is, Nusrat Ghani, that people are still feeling the impact, directly or indirectly, from what Rachel Reeves calls the kamikaze budget of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. So much so that even your Conservative colleagues are feeling the pain and say they can't afford their increased monthly mortgage payments. Surely that underlines the failure of economic management of the economy.
And are you OK? Because I think, I just think the struggle for ministers is real.
It's a privilege
so
to
hard.
serve as a minister, and we are very well rewarded. I don't know what George's personal circumstances are like, but interest rates have increased across the world, and it was mostly to do with COVID, to be honest, and we all need to recognise that is what it's about, Wes. You know that's true. And then, obviously, the impact of Putin's invasion in Ukraine. But, look, we have halved our inflation. We have a plan which has enabled us to raise the threshold when people start contributing so they have more money in their pocket. We've raised the national minimum wage, and now if you're earning around £35,000, you'll see an extra £450 back in your pocket. That's what it means to actually have a plan. It is working, and we've now got to stick with it.
Right.
Not sort of flip-flop with whatever Labour Party may come up with next.
We'll come on to what Labour is or isn't proposing. When you say you've got to stick to the plan, does that plan include tax cuts in the budget?
Well, you know that it's for the Chancellor, and we haven't got that long to wait for the spring
budget. Would you like to see tax cuts in the budget?
I always like to see people keeping more of the money that they earn. But look, I'm pleased to where we have got to, being able to ensure that our plan is working, that we can halve inflation and be more generous in enabling people to keep more of the money that they earn. What we have to do is also reflect on what could come down the line, because Labour Party's not been able to explain what their plan is to pay for this £28 billion black hole spending spree they want.
Well, since Nuz has brought it up, it was, at one point, Wes, the centrepiece of Labour's plan for growth, an industrial strategy that included £28 billion a year if you win the election, to be spent on green investments, green policies investments. Now, it's been watered down and diluted, and now it seems to be hanging by a thread. Is it going to go?
Well, hang on. The fundamental argument here is that rather than keep on going through the same sticking plaster politics, we want to make sure we give Britain its energy security back, create jobs in parts of the country that suffer deindustrialisation,
but I'm not asking you
and
about
cut
that.
people's bills. That's the premise. And the bit that often gets missed about the plan is that it's about also leveraging in private investment and working with industry.
And the 28 billion?
Of course, there's got that is subject to Labour's fiscal rules. And what Rachel Reeves is saying is that whether it's plans for spending or plans for tax cuts, we're going to behave in a responsible way, because we saw with that disastrous mini-budget what happens when politicians prioritise ideological hobby horses over responsible management of the country's
So are you
finances.
not in favour? Let me just show our viewers this headline in The Times. There's little room for big tax cuts, Hunt tells Tories, that's the Chancellor, telling his party ahead of the March the 6th budget. Now, this follows the International Monetary Fund urging Jeremy Hunt to curb borrowing instead. A few weeks ago, Jeremy Hunt said, no, we're going to have a tax-cutting budget. Which Jeremy Hunt do you like, West Streeting? Big tax coming. Do you support that? You've been criticising the government for the highest tax burden on record. So presumably you want to see big tax cuts.
Of course we want to see taxes coming down for working people.
On March the 6th.
And that's one of the reasons why, when Labour set out spending plans and we set out how we'll pay for them, it's making sure that those who can afford it pay their fair share. The non-doms, ending tax breaks on private schools, the windfall tax on oil and gas giants that are enjoying record profits.
Some of those are tax rises. I'm talking about tax cuts.
And of course, because we want to see the burden on working people fall. And Rachel's clear that's her instinct.
So your
too.
support, Hunt
You've got to take, I think, a couple of things into consideration. One is the warnings not just of the IMF but of the OBR about the way in which this government behaves recklessly. And secondly, I don't think people are daft. They know that a general election's coming.
Yes.
And it'll be tax cuts today and tax rises from the Conservatives after the election.
Is the problem.
That is their record
that is the problem. It's a bribe.
Low growth, high tax. Low growth, high.
All right. Well, hang on. It's a bribe.
We've been doing everything that we can to make sure people can keep more of the money that they earn, which is why I pointed out.
But is it affordable?
All the initiatives, which is why it's all been done incrementally. But the reality is we have a plan. And unfortunately, Wes has talked about this £28 billion
I've done that. We'll come back to that.
But he hasn't given us any idea how he's going to raise the money to pay for this spending spree. And that should be quite frightening. And you talked about Rachel Reeves. She's now flip-flopped or U-turned. I'm not quite sure on bankers'
All right, we'll come on to that.
So
but
we're not quite sure where you stand on anything today.
Just before we get on to bankers' bonuses, which we will, first of all, why do you think those tax cuts are affordable?
Well, this is
because she backed Liz Truss, so Nuz has got form when it comes to backing reckless decisions.
Are you, Nuz?
How they've got the brass neck, though, to talk about fiscal responsibility. Look at the record, not just of the mini-budget, 14 years of low growth, high taxes,
halving
inflation,
inflation, bouncing back out of COVID better than what was suggested that we would be able to do, being able to bring more investment into this country compared to Germany and France combined to some of our expertise, technology and life science industries. We've got a fantastic plan to ensure that we can continue.
Although, Nusrat, what do you say to people who've been dragged into higher rates of tax?
Well, look, I have my own personal perspective, but I will leave it down to the Chancellor to put forward his plan.
No, what's your perspective?
I'm a traditional Conservative. I always think we should do everything that we can.
Even though you've increased taxes, the tax burden on most people by freezing those thresholds.
The money that they earn. But look, we are dealing on the background of COVID, where we were incredibly generous in supporting families and businesses, and of course dealing with the issues of Putin invading Ukraine.
Yeah, and we've heard an awful lot of that, and of course we know it. Let's talk about bankers' bonuses, because it was brought up before Prime Minister's questions here in the studio and during. Let's just take a look at this clip from the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves.
Of all the things that he could save from the wreckage of the kamikaze budget that he chooses to press ahead with, is their plan to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses.
Well, that was Rachel Reeves' response to Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement in November 2022, when he did reverse many of Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget measures. Yesterday, though, in a screeching U-turn, Rachel Reeves has changed her mind. Let's have a look at this headline. BBC News, bankers' bonuses, no cap under Labour, says Reeves. What's changed?
Well, the cap's gone, and in the long list of things that we will inherit if we win the next election that we have to deal with, this is nowhere near the top of the list.
Yeah, but despite Rachel Reeves saying it was one of the things she criticised the government for keeping.
And she's criticised it very recently, as recently as a few months ago. She was still
the argument that Rachel made around that autumn statement was about priorities. Why is it that the government was talking about working people tightening their belts, feeling their pay go down in real terms as their bills and costs and mortgages and rents rise, but it was a priority to remove the cap on bankers' bonuses. The point she was making was about priorities and the contrast.
Well, I'll tell you who does it. Well, Barry Gardner, who was sitting actually where Nuz is sitting now before PMQs, disagrees. The Labour MP says he doesn't approve of Labour reversing its decision. He wants that cap on bankers' bonuses reinstated. What do you say to him?
Well, Barry's allowed to disagree, but as I said, Rachel...
Yeah, but is he right? It was your policy.
It's not Rachel's priority, and look, tomorrow we've got a big gathering of business leaders from a whole range of sectors of our economy to get together tomorrow, because we can all see that the fundamentals of our economy are weak and the potential of British business is not being realised. And even in leading industries like financial services, where we've been traditional global leaders, that leadership position is not only assailable from our competitors, we are seeing signs of Britain's competitiveness being held back.
All right, well,
so
just to be clear, because you said
we're going to make sure that we have a thriving economy and
of course
booming business in order
right,
that we can fund public services without having
you
to
said
hike
it's
up
not a
taxes on
priority
working
in
people
terms
like
of the cap on bankers' bonuses. So could a Labour government reinstate that cap on bankers' bonuses as you pledged to do?
Well, we could do all sorts of things, but Rachel's been very clear about her priorities.
All right, but then why should people believe you about the £28 billion a year
Rachel.
green investment? You could drop that too. In fact, I'm hearing you may well do so.
Well, because the reason why people should trust Labour is not just about the appalling record of 14 years of Conservative government. It is because on any day of the week, including this one, we can... Hang on, just hear me out.
Yeah, well, then let us respond.
On any day of the week, the Labour Party is regularly criticised to spend more, promise more, pledge more, and we are being ruthlessly disciplined because we know that the fundamentals of the economy are not strong, that the fiscal policy position we would inherit is a bin fire thanks to the Conservatives, and therefore there are harder choices and priorities to be made. And that's what we are doing.
Well,
and that's what Labour's manifesto will reflect.
One of the shadow ministers, Tulip Siddiq, has confirmed that Labour is still committed to that investment of £28 billion a year.
I just can't keep up.
Well, let's take that as the most recent iteration.
But that was this morning, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to be this afternoon, where you said any day of the week. Let's just keep to one day of the week, and the Labour Party sticking to whatever commitment that they're making. I mean, Rachel was, frothing at the mouth when bankers' cap bonuses were lifted, and now all of a sudden you've now reversed your position on that. And this is the reality. We just don't know what the Labour Party...
Or it's your inheritance.
It's the Labour Party.
Their inheritance from you.
No idea what the Labour Party is going to do next. I thought
we don't even know who your Prime Minister's
the Prime Minister was absolutely right. If you're not cutting and pasting from Wikipedia, you're then changing your position on policies that we hold. All it does is make it absolutely clear that you are economically clueless, and that is a dangerous position for any voter to consider.
I know, you've said the brass. Let me bring Leila. in. I mean, this, to some extent, is a dress rehearsal that's going to be... It's going to be repeated again and again and again. It's going to be a very long election campaign.
It is indeed, as we can hear from every episode of PMQs, hearing those lines rehearsed of sticking with a plan, as Rishi Sunak wants to say. But, it is a vulnerable point for you, Wes. I mean, it is to basically keep changing your mind, not answering definitively what you are going to do. It's getting closer and closer now to the point where you are going to have to actually know colours to the mast and say definitively what you are going to do.
And of course we'll set out our manifesto, which will be fully costed and fully funded. And unlike the Conservatives, I can say with 100% confidence that Keir Starmer will lead us into the general election and be the Prime Minister if Labour wins the general election. We can't even guarantee Rishi Sunak will be the leader by the general election. If they get another leader in, as many of them want to do, they will have had as many Conservative Prime Ministers since 2010 as Labour has had in our entire history of more than 100 years. And then you get another 5 years of the Conservative clown show with all of the consequences for our economy and our public services. That is the risk now facing the country. And we make no apologies whatsoever for kicking the tyres on our policies, thinking very carefully about the pledges we make and making sure that we can go into the election with confidence, telling the country that we've got promises that we can keep, promises we can afford, and promises the country can afford.
And those choices
well, just finally, and then we're going to move on.
But just today, where is the position of the Labour Party, the 28 billion?
Well, hang on, as we've done this.
Or let alone, where is the position on this bankers' cap bonuses, considering what Barry Gardner said earlier on today? I just need to know, because it might change by this afternoon.
Well, I'm delighted to know that you're also preparing for the possibility of a Labour government. I'm so keen to know what we're going to do. But it is clear we are committed to our fiscal rules over and above everything else. The promises we make will be promises
that is
we
clear.
can keep.
So the fiscal rules are more important than that investment pledge. Let's
the
put
fiscal
it that
rules
way.
govern everything because, as Liz Truss showed, if you play fast and loose with the public's finances, we all pay a very
well, it still looks shaky. We're going to talk about something completely different, foreign affairs, because actually it was raised at Prime Minister's questions. It's in response to comments, a speech that was made by the Foreign Secretary, Lord David Cameron. He was talking to Conservatives about a two-state solution. This is about Israel and a Palestinian state. Let me just show you this headline in the I newspaper. It says, Cameron didn't clear two-state solution speech with number 10. He was outlining, it's reported, David Cameron, exactly how a state could come about. Rishi Sunak was asked about this and said very clearly, and it sounded like a bit of a slapdown to David Cameron, that actually steps are needed before there are any discussions, intense discussions about a Palestinian state. What did you make of it, Leila?
Yeah, it was quite an interesting development, I thought, actually, at the tail end of PMQs there. It did sound like Rishi Sunak trying to sort of give clarity to what David Cameron said in this speech, in which David Cameron appeared to suggest that Britain was ready to bring forward the moment that it was going to recognise a Palestinian state as something that he said Palestinian people needed on the political horizon in order to bring about peace. Rishi Sunak seemed to say, well, no, that is the end point, not something along the way that is going to bring out peace. And I think that is, that is quite an interesting difference, an interesting gap, I think, that's opened up between Rishi Sunak and David Cameron on this.
Right. Who do you stand with? The Foreign Secretary, David Cameron's position, already talking about a Palestinian state, or Rishi Sunak saying there are many steps needed before we get there?
We've always believed in a two-state solution, and we've always said at the right time we will recognise.
At the right time, but David Cameron's talking about it right now.
I don't think that's what he said, but we've always believed in a two-state solution.
So the quote was, the Foreign Secretary sparked a backlash from some Conservative MPs when he told a reception on Monday evening we should be starting to set out what a Palestinian state would look like. Rishi Sunak said, no, it's too soon. Which is right?
Which approach? We've always believed in a two-state solution.
No, I understand
that. Obviously, all of this will then take time to make sure we're in the right place to recognise that. But the reality is this. We're dealing with Hamas, an Iranian-backed terrorist organisation. We have hostages that are yet to be released. There are lots of other very difficult, very sensitive issues that need to be dealt with. But I don't see a contrast between what David said and what the Prime Minister mentioned today. We've always believed in a two-state solution.
Can I just show you... sorry, lady, you were going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, not the sequence of events. I mean, that does seem to be different in terms of what David Cameron was outlining. The idea of recognising and pre-committing, if you like, to recognising a Palestinian state as part of the trajectory towards peace.
That's a policy shift, isn't it?
No, not at all. But this is just one sentence out of a speech. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because I really haven't... I wasn't at this speech, so I'm not quite sure.
But as you say, these are sensitive issues, and one sentence, the words and the language are important.
But we've always believed in a two-state solution, and our focus at the moment is being focused on exactly getting hostages released, making sure aid gets into Gaza, and also trying to, how does one negotiate with an organisation, a terrorist organisation like Hamas, who is backed by Iran? These are, really complicated situations to be dealing with.
Well, and this is complicated, and it is difficult politically. Whereas if I show you this headline in The Guardian, Labour acts on fears Muslims will not vote for party over Gaza stance. Are you worried about your seat? Because you are getting quite a lot of pressure, reports of an independent candidate standing who's very pro-Palestine because she feels that Labour isn't pro-Palestine enough.
Well, I never take voters for granted. I'm never complacent. But I think that on this question, and going back to the substance of the issue on recognition, I think the urgency comes about as a direct result of the government of Israel and senior politicians in power making it clear that they do not support a two-state solution. They believe in a one-state solution. And I think that it's now the urgent responsibility of the international community to demonstrate that there is an alternative future for the Palestinians without Hamas, and that there is an alternative to the one-state solution being put forward by Netanyahu and his cronies, which is a state of Palestine.
So call for an immediate ceasefire for those sorts of negotiations to develop. That's what many Labour supporters, many of the Muslim supporters, Labour supporters who are Muslim in your constituency want Labour to do.
Well, look, firstly, on the recognition question, we can negotiate with the Palestinian Authority first and foremost.
I know, I'm not asking about recognition. I'm asking about your stance of not calling for an immediate ceasefire.
Well, we want to see a ceasefire, of course we do. But we've also got, these are the facts on the ground, we have got a situation where hostages are still being held and Hamas say they will carry out 7th of October attacks again and again and again. And you've got an Israeli government that has, sure, a responsibility to get its hostages back and safeguard its citizens, but it's going well beyond the boundaries of reasonable self-defence. And how you reconcile these two sides is difficult and complicated. And I only wish it were possible that me as a politician, or the Labour Party, the political party, or even the United Kingdom Parliament, or even the United Nations General Assembly that's voted for a ceasefire could bring that about.
No,
it's
but
not
what's
that
it going to
people don't
do?
want a
No, I know, but what's it going to do
politically? It is about building the
politically?
path to bring an end to this bloody war.
I understand what both of you are saying in terms of looking at solutions, negotiations, and the start of a Palestinian state. But what is happening in your constituency, Wes? There are obviously many Labour supporters who are not happy with your stance, rightly or wrongly. Are you concerned that you're going to lose votes on this issue?
I definitely think there are people who are angry, and there are certainly people who said to me, I'm sorry, I'm not voting Labour now because I don't think the Labour Party has been strong enough on this issue. What I would say in response is, of course, we want to see a ceasefire come about, but it's not as simple as simply demanding or voting for a ceasefire and bringing about an end to this bloody conflict. Secondly, and we can see with the muddle that at the top of the Conservative Party, you are not going to get a serious effort to bring about a state of Palestine under a Conservative government. And finally, in the last 14 years, and in particular in the recent years that the Conservative Party has become a much more right-wing populist party, we have seen no serious attempt whatsoever to deal with Islamophobic hate crime on our streets. They won't even define Islamophobia, let alone tackle it.
Well, let me get Nus to respond to that.
But if you want to see change in this country, the only route to that is change with a Labour government after the next general election.
Well, they're quite serious.
People to keep that in mind,
all right, no, that's
even
clear.
if they're angry that we haven't
we
gone
must hear
as far as they
from
would want
Nusrat
us to
Ghani
go.
in response to what you just said in terms of your party's failure to tackle Islamophobia properly.
We started off this conversation about dealing with Hamas, and we've ended up talking about the situation in your constituency. But it is a very difficult subject to deal. But the reality...
What about your party and what it's doing in terms of tackling Islamophobia?
Well, we're trying to deal with all sorts of inappropriate abuse. I'm not sure exactly what you want to deal with in particular, but we know that recently there's been a rise in both anti-Semitic attacks in public spaces as well as Islamophobic attacks, and we need to make sure that those are quashed and dealt with as quickly as possible. And it's difficult because this is a situation taking place elsewhere but impacts people here, which is why leadership and being measured is absolutely key. But the reality is this: we're dealing with a terrorist organisation, and the assumption that somehow you can have a ceasefire whilst negotiating with them is incredibly difficult. We, as Wes mentioned, we need to make sure, we wanted everything we can to have a ceasefire in place and get more aid into Gaza, but we are trying to work with a terrorist organisation backed by Iran. And they've also got hostages which we have no idea what they're going to do with going forward.
We've only got a few minutes left, and we spoke earlier, Leila, about it being a historic week in politics because it looks as if power sharing at Stormont in Northern Ireland is going to be restored possibly as soon as the weekend, Saturday, and it'll be historic because it'll be the first time the First Minister is from Sinn Féin, Michelle O'Neill. The government has published since the end of Prime Minister's questions this document. It's called Safeguarding the Union. It was presented by Chris Heaton-Harris, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and it contains the details, which I haven't been able to see, and I presume nor has Leila. It contains the details of the deal that has been agreed that brought the DUP back to Stormont. But broadly speaking, we understand that the reassurances are that those trade checks that were going to start between GB and Northern Ireland have been vastly reduced.
Yeah, so obviously now this is where the devil is in the detail here. People will be poring over, including members of the DUP, to see exactly what what has been proposed, whether they satisfy all the fears that the DUP have had all along by this. And of course, Tory MPs will also be looking very closely at that text to see if there is anything in that document that suggests any further integration with the EU. That has obviously been one of the sticking points. So there will be very, very careful watching of that document this afternoon.
Right. I mean, it could mean closer alignment, of course, with the EU. Would that be something that you'd support?
Well, let's look at the detail. I think the most important thing is that we get Stormont back up and running. It is unquestionably in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland that the people they elected are governing the country. We know the health service, for example, is a problem right across the UK. It is in the worst state in Northern Ireland. And I do think that the lack of political leadership is a contributing factor there. So I really hope that we see a breakthrough. And I really hope, going to your point about the Conservative MPs poring over this, that we do not get the headbangers of the Conservative Party, sticking their oar in and making this even more difficult.
Is that a potential problem?
Look, this is a pinch me moment, surely. We may have Stormont up and running by Saturday. I haven't had time to pore over this, but it's remarkable that we're here. I'm so pleased. And see how far the DUP comes, see how far everyone else has come. I don't want to be involved in sort of punditry until reading the detail, because this is so sensitive and we're so close to seeing something quite extraordinary, possibly in the next 48 hours.
Right, and the timing, yes, the timing literally, it could happen in the next few days, couldn't it?
I mean, we are talking kind of in legislation would be passed potentially tomorrow, and then we could have the Assembly back up and running within a couple of days.
And we'll be talking about this story again tomorrow, because there will be movement and reaction to that document we've just showed you. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for my guests throughout the show. And of course, our guests here now. We'll have more Politics Live at 12:15 on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.